All right, Lance Eaton, it's great to see you. I think there's a lot of nuggets and wisdom to be gained from getting together today. This topic is so deep on so many different levels, but from everyone's perspective, things might look a little different, and some things might be a little more important to some than others. You have a really unique perspective. Um, Before we, kind of get into your thoughts on culture and kind of pinpointing, some passionate areas for you, can you just give a little background of yourself, what you're passionate about, and where you've been?
Sure. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for that question. So I think for me, I come from thinking about culture or my experiences as like often feeling both in and outside of culture, or in and outside of certain cultures. So, as somebody who grew up in middle class America, actually, it was an interesting role reversal of my mother was the breadwinner, my father was the caretaker. Learning about the differences in that and how that created different reactions in people from what was traditional, coupled with just throughout my experience being in situations where I was outsider. So my father wanted us to play sports. I did not, at least at that point, have much interest in sports. And so being around people that were really in it and part of it, but also being somebody that like did not want to be there and didn't function or have the same interests about what we were doing. Like I played football for 6 years and I can still say like I've never watched a game. Even the ones I was at or playing in. So I think for me, like that sits heavy with me. Other life experiences, for a while, right out of college, I was working at a place where I worked with a lot of Christian fundamentalists, and at the time I had my, where I was spiritually was around agnostic. I definitely am not Christian fundamentalist, nor have I ever been, and so very, very different space, and the impact of that, of like when you have conversations with people around you, um, what you feel is what they call the Overton window, right? What is the agreeable or the acceptable range of things to talk about? And I knew, and it was evident in that space, like the people around me's Overton window, their culture of what was appropriate or not appropriate, or ways of talking was fundamentally different from mine. I knew, like, I could feel. I sometimes would joke, like, you could always feel the wrath of God's conversation, like right here. And that's overdoing it, but that was clearly an aspect there. And so I think some of these experiences of both finding myself on some levels, like it's easy to look into culture at large and see representations of myself. Like it's really easy to see a variety of demographics of that reflect me. But there were, I think I in hindsight, although they were challenging at times, had experiences that also had me not at the center of experience, at the center of spaces. And that's carried with me a lot, just throughout my different experiences. So I worked as it was a website editor at this company. I moved into working in residential programs with troubled adolescents, and that gave me another lens about, again, thinking of my own experience as adolescents and the challenges many of us face there of always feeling outside until we don't. And then, without going into it too much, like I kind of moved from there into academia, teaching as a part-time instructor at many different institutions. And again, there as an outsider, as somebody who was teaching a lot. And I mean, in about 5 or 6 years, I taught over 80 courses. And
Wow.
if you're a full-time tenure track professor, you're teaching maybe 8 courses a year. And I'm like, I was doing that a semester. I mean, like, so, and being there and being an outsider in that space too, because, while higher ed exists entirely dependent on adjuncts, it's often been framed as like they're the migrant workers of higher ed, in the sense that they do really move around. There's seasonal work. There's no commitment there's very little commitment. So a lot of these things shaped me and thinking about what culture is, work culture is, the idea that like in many of these situations, like where my life and the cultures that I'm embedded in there ended and where work culture began, like it was hard to really feel those lines were definitive, or even clear. And so like it was very hard not for me to feel, in multiple cultures at work in any space that I was. And I think that's an interesting thing because, I'll give an example of what I mean by this. Like
Sure.
because I was teaching, because I worked part-time at all these places, I didn't have health insurance. So in order to have health insurance, I was continuing to work overnight at a residential program. So I would be working awake overnight, and then I would be teaching in the morning, and I may not be teaching for a few hours. So like I would have to drive somewhere, take a 2-hour nap to refresh, and then go and teach. And like there's no way I can easily compartmentalize that so that like I am perfectly ready and going, or not feeling like the brunt of these systems and these different work cultures, along with like my need to actually sleep as a human being.
Yeah, to take care of yourself.
Right. But like
Right.
the only way you can take care, like it's this interesting dynamic. Like the only way I could take care of myself is by having these jobs to pay these bills. So it's this, it's this really complex mix. And I've thought about that a lot as I've moved into. I currently now have worked full time in higher education, more as a advisor to faculty and in different parts of organizations around how they think about learning, how they think about engagement. But I would say, when I think about all of this, I think these are things that have been formative in just how I approach it or how I think about it in the context of learning, in the context of a team that I lead, in the context of how I work with others, or at least I hope I continually keep that in mind.
Well, thanks. Well, first, thanks for sharing that. Some of the personal experiences and growing up, and first places of being a part of a group where maybe the boundaries were unwritten, but you could really feel them. And that's interesting because it's almost like there's natural cultures. There's natural cultures, and then there's ones that are created and developed. And it seems like based on your experiences personally, professionally, you're getting these little tidbits where you go, and it shapes you to a certain extent. So, when we ask the question, what does culture mean to you? What would you say to something like that?
Another really, really good question. I think I might just step back a little and thinking about what you said as a whole. And, I think that idea of natural cultures, if I were to push a little bit, I might think of it as more inherited cultures. And that's not necessarily the same thing as natural. And the reason I think about it that way is, at times throughout history, and this, I should frame this with like, one of my degrees is in history, so I have this framework of looking at things through that lens. Is at different times decisions were made and became part of the culture, right? So like in the United States, we made certain decisions, or people made certain decisions that had long downstream effects. Sometimes those were really good, like the idea of developing ourselves as our own nation and breaking away from England. Like we can look at a couple hundred years later and say, okay, we think this was a good idea. We're pretty sure. But that was a set of decisions people made, and from that we created the United States culture. But there's also other decisions that were made that also had these more pernicious long-term effects about how we view and think about and just what feels natural. And so a good example of that is like when decisions were made within the colonies of who gets to be an indentured servant and who gets to be a slave, and how that had this snowball effect. To today, we see some of the consequences in that of how really of how we see and engage in different people, or understand or frame problems, big and small, through either individual or cultural or ethnic, racial lenses. And so I think that's a piece for me, is always trying to balance when I think about culture it's both like, it's hard to really think about culture without thinking of it across time and those numerous forces to kind of create what feels natural, coupled with like the experiential piece of like how we as individuals are capturing or experiencing the different messages, both evident and subtle, right? So there's lots of evident ways, and we see this in how we construct our roads. Like, we drive on the right side of the road. England doesn't, and like, that's a cultural thing. And those are bound in decisions long ago. And at the same time, like, where we choose to, or like how we choose to walk on roads or drive on roads, it becomes a little bit more of our individual influences. So I think when I look at that idea of like, what does culture mean to me, I think in the individual, I think it is this strong interplay with history coupled with like a meaning making that is both at times empowering and resistant. In thinking about the experiences that I spoke to, like when I was in those that work environment that had a very particular culture, I was making a decision to be there, and I was also trying to like understand. Oops, we have a special guest apparently. Apparently, my cat has something to say. Sorry about that. The pleasures of Zoom and pandemic.
Oh, no doubt.
So, little bit lost of track. So, this idea of like the tension between the individual and the culture, I think I saw it in this experience of at work, in this particular work environment, that like I had to think about it in this way. I could completely judge everybody around me and say like, this is, they're the ones that are wrong. I could internalize it and be like, I'm the one that's wrong. And first of all, just framing that in right and wrong was a problem.
Right.
But I could also recognize, and I think this is one of the things I really appreciated, was like, I got to understand and appreciate fundamental evangelical Christians in a way that, like, I don't think in any other context I would. And so, to me, I think culture is at its best when it's helping us to humanize one another and to recognize like we have different experiences that lead us down different paths, but we can still be in a room together trying to learn and understand like how that cultural force works on us as individuals, because it inevitably does. Like none of us get away from culture because it's involved. It's language, it's movement, it's relations, and all of those we absorb for years before we actually have language to even challenge or question or think about.
You bring up a couple of really interesting points, Lance. One, if I could, kind of recapture, and please correct me if I misunderstood. This concept of a natural culture being that it might not be by choice. It's something that's inherited, that you grow up in, you're around, and you could be constantly reminded of. It's sometimes chosen, sometimes not chosen. And then there's this created culture, so to speak, where it's designed with these things you talk about, how this, the healthy environment where we're humanizing and building up and figuring out with everyone's experiences with the natural, culture, so to speak, how does that kind of interplay? And it gets to a point that you've and I've talked about over the years and recently over the past, week is, the concept of a healthy tension in growing culture. I was wondering if you go into that a little bit and explain, what do you mean by that?
Sure. Thank you. One other thought just in this, like, I almost wonder if again, I probably overthink words because I'm a nerd. But like, I almost wonder if the terminology is maybe even passive culture versus active culture. So passive being kind of that what kind of comes to us and is just embodied versus that which we're actually really thinking about and shaping. So, and actually that leads into this idea of tension in culture. And I think that's a lot of what we're dealing with around the tension is that which is passive, that's what that we've just absorbed. And sometimes like there are pieces of culture that we want to absolutely hold on to. There's parts of our legacy and what that we want to hold on to, but there's other parts that, again, those downstream effects have effects and they're not necessarily useful. Do we need to hold on to them? And I'll give a great example around this is when I work with faculty, one way I try to have a conversation is we all think of the traditional classroom, right? That is a culture. The sage on the stage, had typically been he stands up and he waxes poetic about his pristine knowledge, and the students there absorb and they take notes, and it just like it's this perfect transfer, this transference. Now we have questions about how much that actually really happened in the past, but let's pretend it's real. We know that is how we've come to understand learning in the past, but does that mean we have to stick with that, especially as we come to understand things like universal design for learning and think about things like accessibility? I again, this is one of those areas where I think a lot about in my own experience of I'm dyslexic, but I'm dyslexic when it comes to hearing. So dyslexia is a language processing issue, and so it's not just reading, it's also hearing. And if I'm not in a good audio environment, like I can have a lot of trouble. I'm also a good listener, and that those things seem at tension, but they're not, like, because I have to actively, constantly listen, which means I may not have to take notes in a class. I may be able to be doodling, and I did this plenty in my classes. Like, it could be doodling, but I could still be absorbing. And that wasn't always understood. So kind of, to me, there, like right there is the tension of like who I was as an individual and what worked for me for learning versus what was the passive or the traditional, the accepted, and trying to negotiate that. I lucked out and I've learned the language to explain and share that whenever I'm in the classroom and as a student. But I think that's a lot of the things is like, how do we address or shift those things? Because so much about an active culture is the idea that we're trying to do something, and which entails change, or it entails kind of pushing, and that tension is supposed to be there because we are rubbing things, or tearing things apart, or pushing things together, as it were. So I would just say I think that's an important piece, and then the other part is within that, like, because we are these different people embedded in different cultures, right? So my framework would be any one of us are in many different cultures, right? There's the family life culture, and that's informed by lots of things. There's our work culture. There's our social culture. I think doubly so, especially now that we have these digital devices where we're in conversations and in digital spaces that also carry all sorts of expectations and demands and stuff like that. So anytime we're together, we have all of that in us. And those are pieces that are gonna bubble up. Those are pieces that are gonna, be there when we're trying to aim for a organizational goal or for a team goal. Those things don't go away. I think the pandemic is a good example where we saw.
No doubt. Just was thinking about that. I mean, what kind of hardships and tension and really bringing stuff to light it was the pandemic.
Yeah, I
this
mean,
area especially.
And I think particularly, for a lot of my friends and colleagues, particularly those who were parents, right? And like they're at home, they're trying, the ones that were lucky enough to be able to work from home, right? The ones that didn't lose their job or didn't have to like be out there risking their lives and their families' lives, which is, again, all other sorts of tensions. But I'll speak to this one in particular of like, how do you be a professional when your kid is screaming in the background because like their kid is stressed out, because we're all stressed out, and that's its own, like, what I appreciated about that is just the fact that it got more tension than is realized, because that kid is probably screaming in many different ways that the parent is aware about, and nobody else is, which means they come to work, they're trying to do their work, they're trying to be engaged in that space, but they also know somewhere in the background their kid is screaming. Maybe it's at the, at the preschool, maybe it's at school, that whatever that kid is screaming about, that's a problem that that parent has to address and also be a professional. And so I think that's also what I think about in terms of those tensions and being aware of and validating them as real. Because I think sometimes we're not supposed to bring our full selves to places, and I don't know that that's possible, or at least for me, I don't think that's possible.
There's definitely carryover for sure, and when you mentioned that, Lance, about healthy tension and tension in general, where my brain goes is, well, you need that for growth and for in maturity as a culture, as a mature set of ways of operating and so forth. So I know without that healthy tension, if things are with no tension, there's really no expanding, no growing, no, there's a concept about going beyond skill development, going just beyond your skill where you're at, that little bending and twisting of practice over and over get you better. It builds up the baseline a little bit higher. I think it's the same thing with growing a culture in a place where, there's the tension of other cultures and other situations that are conflicting with one that's maybe trying to be designed in a workplace culture. But there's also shaping intent, having the tension for growth of that, architected, culture, and that in whatever area you're in. Can you talk about just maybe from your experiences, just the growth aspect of that healthy tension and why no tension is not good?
Sure. So it comes in, there's several different lines of thought. I think the idea of no tension being not good, I think that's true, because if, how do you not have people together? How do you not have people together trying to do things with different motivations and there not be tension? I find that, to me, that's, I don't want to say a big lie, but I think it's there's a bit of astroturfing that's going on, or there's a bit of paving over. To not have tension feels like that seems wrong. I think also the absence of tension in this context of growing is appropriate to highlight, because you, I don't mean you, obviously, it is hard for there to be new ideas, for there to be something different in a world in where there isn't tension. And I say that because, for many organizations, because we're in a capitalist system, it's driven by competition. It's driven by how do we move? How do we continue to compete? How do we continue to offer products in an ever-changing environment? That without those things, I don't want to make it sound drastic, oh, you're lost, but you lose a certain edge, you lose certain opportunities as an organization. On the individual and that concept of kind of growth and learning, I think you nailed it really well in that concept of really, creating that what is it, the Goldilocks effect. You want something that's outside their reach, but you don't want something that is down the road, right? You don't want something that's impossible, and that even finding that is going to differ. And so again, there's more tension there of working with individuals and figuring out where exactly is their happy medium, where exactly is something that pushes them to grow. And then one further piece of this that I think is, again, it is a valid thing that I've certainly seen and thought about is I guess the piece I was going to say is motivation, and thinking about what that looks like, and that it looks like different things to different people. Because I am very lucky to be able to work in environments that I'm really excited about, that are, just by the fact that I'm there, are rewarding, and therefore help motivate me to want to do the best I can. But the reality is there's many people who are working for a paycheck, because work isn't their full culture, their full identity. Their full identity is fly fishing on the weekend, spending time with family, earning enough money so they can go on their vacations and visit different places or the like. And so you have, I put these up as like, I don't want to put these up as like, completely contrasting items or contrasting entities. I think it's more of a continuum, but that's another tension to be working through and to be thinking about is what are the motivations? Like ultimately we're all there for a paycheck, but some of us have the benefit to be really engaged in it. And some of us we have the skills and we're there because we want the paycheck, but there's an end to that. They're not necessarily going to be enthusiastic or whatnot. So like realizing that might also mean to think about I don't want to say different reward systems, but different engagement systems, different methods of motivating and helping them grow in ways that are useful for the organization and hopefully have some value to that individual.
Yeah. Well, Lance, that's very, very interesting. I think you bring up a couple of good points, and I want to make sure I capture this and kind of recap it. There's one, to grow and have that tension requires a little bit beyond that, the capability, so to speak, of whatever that development of that skill or that method of operating is, so and so. But there needs to be some motivation to go there, to do that, and that's definitely a discussion for an entire different segment about what it takes to motivate, and that seems to be, a pretty important aspect of building culture. One thing you mentioned too is, you talked about a continuum, and just to kind of finish off our awesome discussion. It's great. This is the good stuff. But you talk about culture as a moving goal. It's forming, reforming. It's a process, and people, need to be motivated, but also it's somewhat people understanding the process and getting there. How important is that? Just if you're going to sum up, our conversation with that topic, what are your thoughts?
I think the thing that came to mind as I was hearing you reflect back some of our priming for this, like we think of culture as just kind of almost as a static thing, but it's a very rich ecosystem. And within those ecosystems, right? Like in that ecosystem, every piece has its part to play, and anything off in those pieces have these ricochet effects. And I think the thing we sometimes forget is it's an ecosystem with people. And like to make this a little more probably a little more ridiculous, those people themselves are like ecosystems, all the different cultures they are part of, right? So it to be a little ridiculous, it's ecosystems of ecosystems.
Sure.
And I think it's incredibly challenging, but also fascinating to be thinking of it or looking at it through that lens and having that to better, again, kind of pulling it back to the individual, better understand like how people are there, how they're bringing that full system into those spaces. And I think if we can recognize that and we can validate that, like I see you as a person with this multiplicity of things, I think we create a space that is more valuable to our community, to our culture, to our work communities and the like. It helps to make it just not another cog in the wheel, because nobody likes feeling like they are just there to feed the machine. We all have this richness going on that sometimes in the pursuit of goals that we also need to do as work and work cultures. We sometimes stumble over recognizing that value of the inherent value of that individual.
Yeah, no doubt, 100% agree. And it just to sum up, talking about the many cultures within the cultures of the own individual's personal, maybe a natural culture and their experiences that makes up who they are and what they're dealing with outside of a work culture. It reminds me of many, many different Venn diagram that has 18 circles that are overlapping, and then one big circle of what the work culture is. But then the big circle could be in a different circumstance, like their life culture or the community culture. So there's a lot of overlapping, and there's a lot in understanding that and recognizing that, and certainly the process. Well, Lance, this has been great. Love to continue this conversation. Thank you so much. This is we touched the tip of the iceberg.
Right. Absolutely. My pleasure, Mike. Thank you.